Okay, so imagine that you want to construct an enterprise that generates over $4 billion in cash every single year, completely off the grid, without a single legal contract or government charter. You want to control 80% of a global market, command a private distribution network spanning 2 continents, and maintain a profit margin that hovers consistently around 5,000%. Sounds impossible. And yet, during the late 1970s and 1980s, a small coalition operating out of Colombia did precisely that. This was not a lucky streak, nor was it merely a byproduct of raw, unfettered violence. It was a masterclass in market timing, vertical integration, and aggressive corporate expansion. The Medellín Cartel, spearheaded by Pablo Escobar, did not succeed simply because its leaders were ruthless. It succeeded because it solved a complex logistical and economic puzzle that formal international trade had failed to address. How to extract raw agricultural commodities in South America, refine them into high-density products, and deliver them with absolute reliability to an insatiable consumer base in North America. To understand how this illicit conglomerate was built, you have to look at the economic conditions of Colombia in the mid-20th century. For decades, the country's legal export economy relied heavily on volatile commodities like coffee, flowers, and emeralds. The financial infrastructure was fragmented, and vast rural regions existed entirely outside state authority. When global demand for agricultural products fluctuated, rural populations were left without viable livelihoods. Meanwhile, the geography of the Andean region provided ideal microclimates for cultivating coca leaf, alongside thousands of miles of unpatrolled coastlines and dense canopy cover. By the early 1970s, early smugglers recognized that the established trade routes used for moving contraband tobacco and emeralds could be repurposed for a far more lucrative payload. The turning point came when the primary consumer market shifted. Throughout the 1960s, illicit trade in North America centered primarily on cannabis, a bulky commodity with low value-to-weight ratios and high transport risks. Cocaine changed that fundamental equation. It was compact, lightweight, highly addictive, and commanded an extraordinary price per kilogram. The economic incentive to build a dedicated supply chain was overwhelming. The core mechanism of Escobar's economic model was continuous, end-to-end control of the supply chain. In the language of business strategy, this was absolute vertical integration. The process began in the rural growing zones of Bolivia, Peru, and eastern Colombia, where local farmers harvested raw coca leaves. At the base level, the economics were heavily skewed against the primary producer. A farmer might receive a few $100s for enough leaf to produce a single kilogram of coca base. Once converted into base, the product moved to clandestine processing laboratories hidden deep in the Colombian jungle. There, cheap chemical solvents, ether, acetone, and hydrochloric acid, were used to refine the base into pure cocaine hydrochloride. The value multiplied exponentially at each stage. A single kilogram that cost roughly $1,000 to produce in the jungle was worth between $5,000 and $8,000 once it reached shipping hubs in Colombia. The real wealth, however, was generated in the transport phase. Moving the product across international borders was the primary bottleneck, and whoever owned the transport infrastructure captured the largest share of the margin. Escobar and his partners replaced small-scale smugglers who carried product in modified suitcases with industrial logistics. They purchased fleet aircraft, ocean-going vessels, and eventually purpose-built semi-submersibles. They established refueling outposts across the Caribbean, including a secure intermediate hub at Norman's Cay in the Bahamas. By the time a wholesale kilogram arrived in Miami or Los Angeles, its value skyrocketed to $35,000. When distributed down to the street level and cut with adulterants, that same single kilogram generated up to $100,000 in gross revenue. The cartel achieved gross profit margins exceeding 80 to 90%, far surpassing the profitability of any legitimate corporate entity on the planet. At its peak in the mid-1980s, the scale of this financial engine defied conventional economic tracking. According to estimates by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and Historical Assessments by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the Medellín Cartel was grossing an estimated $22 billion annually in raw cash. Independent economic researchers, including investigative journalist Tom Wainwright in his analysis of illicit market economics, note that the group was spending upwards of $2,500 every month just on rubber bands to bundle the stacks of physical currency. The total revenues rivaled those of major multinational corporations like ExxonMobil or General Motors at the time, and equaled a significant percentage of Colombia's entire legal gross domestic product. At one point, the financial intelligence reports estimated that Escobar personally controlled a fortune exceeding $30 billion, placing him among the 10 richest individuals on Earth. The enterprise was shipping upwards of 15 tons of cocaine into the United States every single week, employing tens of thousands of people across the supply chain, from rural leaf pickers and laboratory technicians to pilots, corrupt customs officials, legal advisors, and retail distributors. This staggering volume created an entirely new operational problem: the cash burden. In an era before modern digital financial tracking, billions of dollars in physical paper currency were flowing back into Colombia from North America. Paper money is bulky and heavy. $1 million in $20 bills weighs over 50 pounds. The cartel was generating cash faster than it could be laundered or reinvested. Millions were buried in plastic drums across farmland, stored in warehouse walls, or written off entirely. Estimates suggest that roughly 10% of the cartel's annual revenues, over $2 billion a year, was routinely lost to water damage, rats, and spoilage in hidden storage facilities. This was treated not as a catastrophe, but as a standard cost of doing business. To integrate these vast flows of physical cash into the formal international financial system, the cartel pioneered systemic money laundering techniques. They exploited structural loopholes in Panama's banking sector, funneled funds through real estate developments in South Florida, and utilized complex networks of shell corporations registered in offshore tax havens. Millions were absorbed by local Colombian commercial banks, construction firms, agricultural estates, and professional football clubs, permanently blurring the boundary between illicit cash flows and the legitimate national economy. Yet this unprecedented accumulation of capital contained the seeds of its own systemic failure. In any market economy, a business survives by enforcing contracts through the legal system. In an illegal market, where courts do not exist to enforce property rights, violence becomes the default mechanism for contract enforcement and market discipline. As the cartel grew richer, the cost of maintaining security and market share escalated exponentially. Violence was no longer just a defensive measure. It became a major line item on the balance sheet. The turning point arrived when the cartel attempted to capture the state itself. By using capital to buy political influence, fund public works projects, and pay off public officials, the enterprise sought to insulate itself from legal consequences. However, when the Colombian government, supported by international law enforcement agencies, moved to implement an extradition treaty with the United States, the strategic alignment collapsed. Extradition represented an existential threat to the cartel's business model because it removed operatives from an environment where their capital could buy impunity. What followed was a catastrophic systemic breakdown. The cartel pivoted from an economic enterprise into an open conflict with the state. Millions of dollars were redirected into funding private militias, bribing whole departments, and executing public officials, judges, and journalists. The violence disrupted the delicate logistical networks that made the business profitable in the first place. High-profile bombings, assassinations, and territorial wars against rival groups such as the Cali cartel severely eroded political stability and public tolerance. The economic model, built entirely on central command and high-risk logistical efficiency, proved unable to adapt to continuous military and intelligence pressure. By the early 1990s, coordinated operations by joint task forces tracked down and dismantled the key nodes of the executive leadership. When Escobar was killed on a rooftop in Medellín in December 1993, the centralized cartel structure shattered completely. The physical empire crumbled, but the economic architecture did not disappear. The fall of the Medellín cartel did not eliminate the global cocaine trade. It merely forced the market to evolve. The centralized, monolithic monopoly model was replaced by smaller, more flexible, and decentralized criminal networks that avoided open conflict with the state while continuing to service global demand. The capital generated during those 2 decades permanently altered the financial geography of Latin America, leaving behind a legacy of institutional corruption, distorted real estate markets, and deeply entrenched smuggling corridors that endure to this day. The flags came down, the machine didn't.